These commercial monstrosities have to go, or I'll have them towed and fine you into oblivion by morning." The voice was like gravel grinding against silk, a sound that tried to be sophisticated but couldn't hide its coarse, demanding nature. I turned from my front door, keys still in hand, to see a woman who could only be described as a monument to entitlement. She was plus-size, draped in a floral muumuu that seemed to be losing a battle against her sheer mass, and her face, framed by a helmet of aggressively blonde hair, was pinched into a mask of supreme disapproval. Her name, as I would soon learn with the force of a battering ram, was Karen, and she was the president of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association. She was pointing a perfectly manicured but sausage-like finger at the two black Chevrolet Suburbans parked in my driveway. They were identical, immaculate, and to the untrained eye, perhaps a bit imposing. To her, they were a personal affront, a violation of the pristine, beige conformity she lorded over. I'd been in the house for less than a month, most of that time spent overseas on a protective detail, and this was my welcome home. Not a fruit basket, not a friendly hello, but a threat delivered with the casual authority of a petty tyrant. A fine, towing, oblivion. It was so absurdly aggressive that for a second I thought it had to be a joke, a bizarre neighborhood initiation ritual. But the hard, unblinking stare in her eyes told me she was deadly serious. The setting sun cast long shadows across my newly mown lawn, the very lawn I'd paid a service to maintain to HOA standards while I was away. I looked at the Suburbans, then back at her. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I had faced down armed threats in crowded marketplaces, navigated motorcades through hostile territory, and stood guard over the most powerful people in the world, all with a pulse rate that barely fluttered. Yet this woman, with her weaponized sense of neighborhood aesthetics, had managed to ignite a slow, burning anger deep in my gut. This wasn't just a dispute over parking. It was a declaration of war on my doorstep. Before we get into exactly what these vehicles were, and the world of hurt this woman was about to bring down upon herself, do me a favor. If you love stories about entitled bullies getting what they deserve, hit that subscribe button right now, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare. I want to hear them all. Now let's get back to Karen and the biggest mistake of her power-tripping life. My initial reaction was one of disciplined calm, a habit drilled into me over 15 years in the U.S. Secret Service. You don't react, you assess. You don't escalate, you de-escalate. "Ma'am," I started, my voice level and devoid of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. "My name is Jack Renner. I just moved into number 42. I don't believe we've been formally introduced." I extended a hand, a gesture of peace, an offering of civility. She stared at my hand as if I'd offered her a dead fish. "I know who you are," she sniffed, ignoring my handshake completely. "I'm Karen Miller, president of this HOA, and I make it my business to know who is jeopardizing our community's property values. Your trucks," she said the word like it was a contagion, "are in clear violation of Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Covenants. No commercial vehicles, work trucks, or oversized vehicles are to be parked in driveways overnight." She recited the rule from memory, a clear sign she'd been stewing on this, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. I took a slow breath, letting it out through my nose. My wife Sarah had warned me about the HOA. She'd called it intense after receiving a notice about the specific shade of white on our mailbox flag. I had dismissed it as typical suburban minutia. I had been wrong. This was something else entirely. This was a fiefdom, and I had just met the queen. The problem was, this queen had no idea who she was trying to push around. She saw a new homeowner with two big black trucks. She didn't see the Tier 1 federal law enforcement officer who ran the entire protective detail for this region. She didn't see the man who coordinated with local, state, and federal agencies to secure visiting dignitaries and protect the continuity of government. And she certainly didn't understand that the commercial monstrosities in my driveway were U.S. government property, armored, equipped with advanced communications arrays, and absolutely essential to my ability to do my job, a job that involved national security. Trying to explain the nuances of federal supremacy over a local HOA bylaw to a woman high on her own authority Felt like trying to explain quantum physics to a house cat, but I had to try. It was the professional thing to do. After our disastrous first encounter on my lawn, where Karen had slapped a violation notice with a staggering $500 fine into my hand before marching off, I went inside. Sarah met me at the door, her face a mixture of concern and, "I told you so." She had watched the whole exchange from the living room window. "Welcome home, honey," she said, her voice laced with irony as she took the violation slip from my hand. "Let me guess. The Suburbans?" I nodded, running a hand through my hair. She called them commercial monstrosities and threatened to fine me into oblivion. Sarah's eyes widened at the amount on the slip. $500? For a first warning? Jack, that's insane. The mailbox flag was only 25. We had moved to Oakmont Estates for a reason. After years of living in transient apartments and temporary housing, close to various assignments, we wanted roots. We wanted a yard for our 2 kids, a quiet street, a sense of community. I was now a senior special agent in charge, a desk job by title but a field command in practice. My travel was less frequent, but my responsibilities were immense. This house, this neighborhood, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to decompress from the high-stakes pressure of my work. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The very tools of my trade, the vehicles that represented my commitment to protecting this country, were being declared a nuisance by the queen of the cul-de-sac. That evening, instead of unpacking the last of my gear, I sat at our new dining room table, a copy of the HOA covenants on one side and my laptop on the other. I decided to approach this the same way I'd approach any complex operational problem, with calm, meticulous documentation and a clear, professional line of communication. Assuming she was merely ignorant of the law, not malicious, was the first step. I drafted a letter to the HOA board. It was a masterclass in polite, firm, and legally precise language. I introduced myself formally, stated my profession, and clarified my role as the special agent in charge for the regional field office. I then explained the nature of the vehicles. I detailed that they were official United States government property assigned to me for official duties directly related to national security. I deliberately avoided using the word Secret Service because we are taught to maintain a low profile, but I made my federal status and the gravity of my duties unmistakably clear. I cited the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which generally holds that federal law preempts conflicting state and local regulations, and gently suggested that any attempt to fine, tow, or otherwise interfere with these federal assets could be construed as obstruction of a federal agent in the performance of their duties. I was careful not to sound threatening, framing it as helpful information to clarify a misunderstanding. I attached a redacted copy of my official vehicle assignment paperwork, blacking out sensitive information, but clearly showing the government insignia and vehicle identification numbers. I ended the letter by respectfully requesting that the violation and the associated fine be rescinded. I sent it via certified mail the next morning, a method that provided a legal record of receipt. I was confident that any reasonable person presented with these facts would back down immediately. The board would see the legal hornet's nest they were about to kick, apologize for the misunderstanding, and we could all move on. I had grossly, catastrophically underestimated the intoxicating power of a little bit of authority in the hands of someone like Karen Miller. A week passed in unnerving silence. I went to work, coordinated logistics for an upcoming protective visit, and tried to settle into a normal home life. The kids loved the backyard, and Sarah was already making friends with a few of the seemingly normal neighbors. I started to believe my letter had done the trick, that the matter was resolved, and Karen was quietly licking her wounds. Then the envelope arrived. It wasn't just a standard letter. It was thick, heavy, and bore the official HOA logo, pressed into the paper with self-important zeal. Inside wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of total war. The first page was a letter from the board, signed by Karen as president. It was dripping with condescending legalese, likely drafted by the HOA's equally small-time lawyer. It stated that the board had reviewed my correspondence and found it insufficient to warrant an exemption. It went on to say that the covenants applied to all residents equally, regardless of their professed occupation. The phrase professed occupation was underlined. They were calling me a liar. They were implying I was making up my job to get out of a parking ticket. The letter informed me that for my failure to comply with the initial notice, the fine had been doubled to $1,000. Furthermore, for my disrespectful and threatening tone in citing federal law, an additional $500 administrative penalty for hostile correspondence had been levied. My total due was now $1,500, payable within 10 days, after which interest would accrue daily. My jaw tightened. This wasn't ignorance anymore. This was malicious. This was a direct challenge. But it got worse. Tucked behind the letter were copies of my own correspondence, but with Karen's handwritten notes in the margins, circled and highlighted. Next to my explanation of the vehicles being government property, she had scrawled, "So what? He thinks he's special?" Next to my citation of the supremacy clause, she had written, "Above the law? I don't think so." It was the kind of petty, insecure response that betrayed her entire motive. This was never about the Suburbans. It was about her power. I was a new, unknown entity in her kingdom, and I had dared to question her authority. My calm, professional letter had been interpreted as a threat to her dominance, and she was responding with overwhelming, irrational force. The final page was a community-wide notice, a copy of which was apparently being sent to every homeowner. It was a thinly veiled attack on me, a reminder that the HOA covenants regarding commercial and oversized vehicles would be strictly enforced without exception, and that certain new residents may need to familiarize themselves with the rules they agreed to when purchasing their home. She was poisoning the well. She was turning me into the neighborhood villain before anyone even got to know me. That evening, the friendly waves from neighbors seemed to dwindle. I saw people whispering on their lawns, their eyes darting towards my house, towards the two black Suburbans sitting innocently in the driveway. A neighbor across the street, a man I'd shared a brief, pleasant chat with just days before, now hurried inside his house when I came out to get the mail, avoiding eye contact. The isolation tactic was working. Karen wasn't just fining me, she was trying to excommunicate me. She was using social pressure as a weapon, turning the very community we had sought into a hostile force. The anger I had felt during our first meeting had now cooled into something else, something far more dangerous for her. Cold, methodical resolve. She had made a critical error. She thought she was fighting a homeowner. She was about to find out she had picked a fight with the United States Secret Service, and I was going to use every investigative skill I had ever learned to dismantle her pathetic little empire, piece by bureaucratic piece. The shift in my mindset was palpable. The disciplined agent who sought de-escalation was gone, replaced by the strategic investigator who dismantled threats. Karen Miller had escalated this beyond a simple dispute. She had made it personal, she had questioned my integrity, and she had targeted my family's peace. This was no longer about defending my right to park government vehicles. It was about exposing a bully who was terrorizing an entire community. My home was now an operating base, and Karen was the target of a full-spectrum investigation. My first move was to go on the offensive, but not in the way she expected. I wasn't going to write another letter or make angry phone calls. I was going to bury her in her own bureaucracy. That weekend, I drafted a series of formal requests under the provisions of the state laws governing homeowners associations. These laws granted every homeowner the right to inspect the association's records. My requests were surgical and exhaustive. I requested copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past 7 years. I requested complete, itemized financial statements for the same period, including all vendor contracts, invoices, and payment records. I demanded a full list of all fines levied against homeowners, specifying the violation, the amount, and the resolution. I wanted to see if her no exceptions rule was actually true. I also requested the minutes from the specific board meeting where they had reviewed my case and decided to triple my fine. I sent each request as a separate, certified letter, creating a legal paper trail that was impossible to ignore. I knew this would do two things. First, it would overwhelm her. Compiling these documents would be a massive, tedious task. Second, it would signal that I was not a typical resident who could be intimidated into submission. It was a declaration that I knew my rights and was prepared to dig. While I waited for the legally mandated response time, I moved on to phase 2. Intelligence gathering. Using my training in protective intelligence and advances, I began to build a profile of the neighborhood's power dynamics. I installed a small, discreet, and perfectly legal security camera on my own property, focused on my driveway and the street in front of my house. Any further harassment, any tow truck, any direct confrontation from Karen would be documented on high-definition video. Then I started taking long walks in the evening, with my dog as a perfect cover. I wasn't looking for confrontations. I was looking for allies. I struck up casual conversations, talking about lawn care, the weather, anything but the HOA. I was mapping the social terrain, identifying who was in Karen's inner circle and who might be a dissident. It didn't take long. I found my first potential ally in George Peterson, a retired widower in his late 70s who lived 3 houses down. I saw him struggling with a heavy bag of mulch and offered to help. As we worked, he talked. He was quiet, gentle, and deeply saddened. He mentioned in passing that his prize-winning roses had earned him a citation because the trellises were non-compliant. But it was what he said next that caught my full attention. "She made me tear down the bench," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was a little memorial for my Martha. Had a small brass plaque. Karen said it was an unapproved structural addition." He looked away, his eyes welling up. A memorial bench for his late wife. I felt a surge of pure, cold rage. This wasn't about property values. This was about cruelty. This was a woman who got off on wielding power over the vulnerable. I had my first piece of the pattern. This wasn't just about me. Karen was a predator, and George was one of her victims. I thanked him for the conversation and told him if he ever needed anything, anything at all, to let me know. As I walked home, the pieces began to click into place. Karen's strength was her perceived authority and the isolation of her victims. My strategy would be to shatter that perception and unite those she had wronged. The documents I had requested would be the hammer, but the stories like George's, would be the chisel that broke her empire apart. The war had begun, and she had no idea what kind of enemy she had made. The boxes arrived a month later, dropped on my porch with a thud by a grudging courier from the HOA's management company. 7 years of paperwork. It was a classic bully tactic, malicious compliance. Karen couldn't legally refuse my request, so she had simply dumped thousands of pages on me, unorganized and unsorted, hoping to bury me in sheer volume. She probably imagined me giving up in frustration. She had no idea she was handing me the very ammunition I needed. For the next 2 weeks, my dining room table, the one we had bought for happy family meals, was transformed into an investigative command center. Every evening after the kids were in bed, Sarah and I would sit down with highlighters, sticky notes, and spreadsheets. Sarah, an accountant before she'd chosen to stay home with the kids, had a forensic eye for numbers. I had the investigator's instinct for patterns and deception. We were a formidable team. We divided the labor. I took the meeting minutes and violation records while Sarah dove into the financials. It didn't take long for the ugliness to surface. In the meeting minutes, I found a clear pattern of Karen's dictatorial control. Motions were passed with little debate. Board members who questioned her were systematically sidelined or voted out in the next election, replaced by her hand-picked cronies. Her name appeared on nearly every motion, her influence absolute. Then I turned to the fines. Just as I suspected, her no exceptions policy was a complete fabrication. I cross-referenced the violation notices with property records. A board member's son had an old rusty pickup truck parked on his street for 6 months without a single fine. A friend of Karen's had built an entire deck without a permit, and the board had retroactively approved it with no penalty. Meanwhile, a young family was fined hundreds of dollars because their child's plastic playset was the wrong shade of green. A Hispanic family was repeatedly cited for lawn maintenance issues that were invisible to the naked eye. The enforcement wasn't just selective, it was discriminatory. It was a tool to reward her friends and punish her enemies. While I was uncovering the social corruption, Sarah found the financial rot. "Jack, look at this," she said one night, her voice tight with anger. She pointed to a line item in the budget, landscaping services. The contract was massive, far above market rate for a community our size. The winning bidder, year after year, was a company called Evergreen Solutions, LLC. A quick search of state business records revealed the truth. The sole proprietor of Evergreen Solutions LLC was a man named Frank Miller, Karen's cousin. She was funneling tens of thousands of dollars of our HOA dues directly into her family's pockets. But the smoking gun was a separate, recurring charge labeled Presidential Administrative Stipend. It was a $500 monthly payment made directly to Karen. The HOA bylaws we had received upon moving in explicitly stated that all board positions were unpaid and voluntary. We dug deeper, searching the minutes. 5 years ago, in a poorly attended meeting during a holiday week, Karen had pushed through a motion to grant herself a stipend for her extraordinary efforts. It was buried in jargon, passed without objection from her crony board, and never mentioned again in any public communication. She was not only a tyrant, she was a thief, embezzling money from the very community she claimed to be protecting. We now had it all: selective enforcement, discrimination, cronyism, and outright embezzlement. It was a perfect textbook case of small-scale corruption. I gathered the most damning documents: the landscaping contract, the record of the stipend vote, the discriminatory fine records, and George's citation for his wife's memorial bench, and laid them out in a neat, undeniable stack. Karen thought she had buried me in paper. Instead, she had handed me her own indictment. The next step was to take this evidence and turn it into a weapon. Armed with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, I knew I couldn't win this fight alone. A lone wolf, even a well-armed one, can be dismissed as a disgruntled individual with a grudge. A chorus of voices, however, is a movement. It was time to build my alliance. My first stop was George Peterson's house. I brought a small portfolio with me, containing only the evidence relevant to him and a few other clear-cut cases of abuse. I didn't want to overwhelm him. I sat in his tidy living room, surrounded by photos of his late wife, Martha, and gently laid out the facts. I showed him the record of his citation for the memorial bench. Then I showed him the record of Karen's friend getting a retroactive pass for an entire unpermitted deck. I showed him the fine against the young family for their child's wrong-colored playset. I didn't need to editorialize. The injustice was plain on the pages. George, a man I knew to be quiet and non-confrontational, stared at the papers, his hand trembling slightly. "I thought it was just me," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of sadness and dawning anger. "I thought I was just an old man who didn't understand the rules." "It was never just you, George," I said softly. "This is a pattern. She does this to people she thinks won't fight back." That was the spark, the realization that his humiliation was not an isolated incident, but part of a calculated system of oppression lit a fire in him. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a witness. He agreed to talk to other neighbors he trusted to share his story. From there, the network grew. George introduced me to the young family with the green playset. I met with them, shared my findings, and listened to their story of constant harassment. They, in turn, introduced me to the Hispanic family who had been relentlessly targeted for their lawn. Within a week, I had a small, secret coalition of the wronged. We met at my house after dark, our cars parked down the street to avoid suspicion. I laid all the evidence on my dining room table: the financial documents, the proof of embezzlement, the pattern of discriminatory fines. The mood in the room shifted from fear and resignation to shock and righteous fury. People who had suffered in silence for years were now looking at each other, realizing they were not alone. The final piece of the alliance fell into place unexpectedly. One of the people I invited was a woman named Jessica, a corporate lawyer who had lived in the neighborhood for a decade. She had always kept her head down, too busy with work to get involved. She had received minor, annoying citations over the years, but had just paid them to make them go away. As she looked over the evidence of financial fraud, the contract with Karen's cousin, the illegal stipend, her professional demeanor took over. "This is more than just breaking HOA rules," she said, her voice sharp and focused. "This is wire fraud. It's embezzlement. These are potential felonies. The personal liability for the board members, if they knew about this, is catastrophic." She looked at me, a new respect in her eyes. "You've built a real case here. I've been ignoring this for too long. I'm in. Pro bono." We had our army, we had our evidence, and now we had our general for the legal battle. We mapped out a two-pronged attack: Jessica would draft a formal, legal demand letter that would put the fear of God into the board. Simultaneously, we would begin the official process outlined in the bylaws for calling a special meeting of the homeowners to vote on a full recall of the board. The petition required signatures from 25% of the homeowners. With our core group and the stories we could now share, we were confident we could get them. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of hope, not just for my own situation, but for the entire community. Karen had built her kingdom on a foundation of fear and isolation. We were about to tear it down with a coalition built on shared truth and a demand for justice. The quiet suburban street was now a battleground, and the revolution was about to begin. With our coalition formed and our strategy set, it was time to spring the trap. Jessica, our pro bono lawyer, worked with a ferocity that was truly a sight to behold. She drafted a demand letter that was a work of legal art, a 10-page document of pure, distilled intimidation. It was sent via courier to Karen and each individual board member, ensuring they couldn't claim they never received it. The letter was a multi-front assault. It started by addressing my specific case, laying out the federal preemption argument regarding the government vehicles in such stark and unequivocal terms that it made the HOA's position look not just wrong, but dangerously ignorant. It cited specific statutes related to interfering with a federal agent and the protection of federal assets, quoting the potential criminal penalties involved. This section alone was designed to make their blood run cold. But that was just the opening salvo. The letter then pivoted to the evidence we had uncovered. It detailed the pattern of selective and discriminatory enforcement, citing Georgia's case and others as clear evidence of capricious and arbitrary governance, a violation of their own fiduciary duty. Then came the kill shot, the financials. Jessica laid out the evidence of embezzlement through the presidential administrative stipend and the blatant conflict of interest in the landscaping contract awarded to Karen's cousin. She used phrases like breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, potential conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of state corporate law. She demanded an immediate independent forensic audit of the HOA's books, the immediate cessation of all payments to Karen and her cousin's company, and the preservation of all financial records pending a potential criminal investigation. The letter concluded by stating that if the board did not comply with all demands within 7 business days, including the full rescission of my fines, we would file a lawsuit seeking not only damages, but the appointment of a court-ordered receiver to take over the HOA's affairs. Crucially, it noted that the suit would name each board member personally, holding them liable for any judgment, a threat that would pierce the corporate veil that usually protects them. While the legal bomb was ticking, Karen, feeling the walls closing in, made her final, fatal mistake. Perhaps she thought a show of force would re-establish her dominance. Perhaps she was simply panicking. On a bright Tuesday morning, while I was on a conference call in my home office, my security camera sent an alert to my phone. I pulled up the live feed. A massive tow truck was backing into my driveway, its yellow lights flashing, aiming for the first of the 2 black Suburbans. And there on the sidewalk, directing the operation with a smug, triumphant look on her face, was Karen. She had finally done it. She had crossed the one line I had explicitly, legally, and professionally warned her not to cross. My conference call was with the head of the National Security Detail for a visiting foreign minister. I calmly interrupted him. "Sir, I apologize, but I have a developing situation at my residence. I need to go handle it. It involves an attempt to seize government assets." There was a stunned silence on the line. "Understood, Jack. Keep me apprised." I hung up, my heart beating a steady, cold rhythm. The time for letters and petitions was over. It was time for a direct confrontation. I walked out my front door, my federal credentials in my pocket, and a very, very grim smile on my face. The show was about to begin. I stepped onto my front porch, the morning sun at my back, casting a long shadow that fell across the tow truck driver as he was hooking a chain to the front axle of the Suburban. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a vision of smug satisfaction. She saw me and her smile widened into a triumphant smirk. This was her moment of victory, the public humiliation of the arrogant federal agent who thought he was above her rules. "It's a little late for discussions, Mr. Renner," she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You were warned." I ignored her completely. My focus was on the driver, a burly man in a greasy jumpsuit who looked deeply uncomfortable. He knew this wasn't a standard repo. "Sir," I said, my voice calm, but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "I need you to stop what you're doing immediately." He paused, looking from me to Karen, clearly confused. "Lady says you're in violation. Gotta tow it," he grunted, gesturing with his thumb toward Karen. "That woman has no authority over this vehicle," I stated, taking a few steps closer. I held up my hand. "This vehicle is the property of the United States government. You are currently in the process of attempting to seize a federal asset." The driver's eyes widened slightly. "What?" "This is an official government vehicle used for protective operations," I continued, my voice level. "Attempting to tow it, disable it, or otherwise interfere with it is a federal offense under Title 18, Section 641 of the U.S. Code. It carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison." Karen let out a derisive snort. "Oh, stop it with your official-sounding nonsense. You can't just say that and expect us to believe you." "Tow it!" she shrieked at the driver. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my credentials, flipping open the leather case to reveal the golden badge of the United States Secret Service and my photo identification. I held it up for the driver to see. "I am Senior Special Agent Jack Renner of the United States Secret Service. This vehicle is part of my protective detail. If you attach that chain, I will have no choice but to place you under arrest for interference with a federal agent in the performance of their duties and attempted theft of government property." The color drained from the driver's face. He looked at the badge, then at my eyes, and saw absolutely no bluff there. He dropped the chain as if it were red hot and took 2 quick steps back, his hands held up in surrender. Whoa, okay, man. No problem. I'm out," he stammered, his bravado completely gone. "I had no idea. She just said it was an HOA thing." He started scrambling to unhook his rig. Karen was incandescent with rage. "What are you doing? I'm paying you to do a job. You can't just listen to him," she screeched, her face turning a blotchy red. By now, the commotion had drawn an audience. Neighbors were peering out their windows and stepping onto their lawns. George was on his porch, watching with rapt attention. The family with the playset was standing in their driveway. The stage was set. I turned my full attention to Karen. My camera was recording everything. "It's over, Karen," I said, my voice low and cold. "You were warned. You received a legal notice detailing exactly what would happen. You chose to ignore it." "You have no power here," she hissed, jabbing a finger at me. "This is my community." "Is it?" I shot back, my voice rising so the watching neighbors could hear. "Is it your community to embezzle $500 a month in an illegal stipend? Is it your community to funnel overpriced landscaping contracts to your cousin? Is it your community to terrorize a grieving widower like George Peterson for putting up a memorial to his dead wife?" A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. George flinched as if struck. Karen's face went from red to a pasty white. She was exposed, her crimes laid bare in the middle of the street for all to see. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The tow truck driver, having successfully detached his truck, practically burned rubber getting out of the neighborhood, leaving Karen standing alone on the pavement, the target of a dozen accusing stares. The Queen had been dethroned in a spectacular, public fashion. Her reign of terror was officially over. The aftermath of the tow truck incident was swift and brutal. The video from my security camera, capturing Karen shrieking, the tow driver's panicked retreat, and my public denunciation of her corruption, spread through the neighborhood's email lists and private social media groups like wildfire. It was the visual proof, the visceral moment that galvanized the entire community. What had been a quiet, behind-the-scenes campaign to gather signatures for her recall became a public movement. People I had never even spoken to came to my door, asking to sign the petition. They shared their own stories of Karen's bullying, petty fines, arbitrary denials for small home improvements, public scoldings for uncut grass. It turned out that nearly everyone had a story. The petition didn't just meet the 25% threshold, it surpassed 70% in under 48 hours. A special meeting of the homeowners was officially called, a mandatory public forum where the recall vote would take place. Karen and her crony board were legally obligated to attend. The week leading up to the meeting was pure chaos for them. The legal demand letter from Jessica had sent the other board members into a panic. Faced with the threat of personal lawsuits and potential criminal charges, their loyalty to Karen evaporated. Two of them resigned immediately via email, claiming they were unaware of the financial irregularities. The remaining board member, a man who had been her staunchest supporter, allegedly had a screaming match with her over the phone before hiring his own lawyer. The HOA's law firm, seeing the mountain of evidence and the personal liability storm on the horizon, formally dropped the association as a client, citing irreconcilable differences. Karen was left isolated, toxic, and legally radioactive. The night of the special meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one place. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. I sat in the front row with Sarah, George, Jessica, and the other families who had formed our initial coalition. Karen and her one remaining board member, a pale, sweaty man named Gerald, sat at a table at the front of the room, looking small and defeated. The meeting began. As per the bylaws, the floor was open for statements regarding the recall. I didn't even need to speak first. George Peterson, holding a framed photo of his late wife, Martha, walked slowly to the microphone. His voice, usually so quiet, was steady and clear as he told the entire community how Karen had forced him to tear down his wife's memorial bench. He was followed by the young mother, who spoke about the stress and anxiety of being constantly harassed over her children's playset. Then the Hispanic father, who detailed the discriminatory fines that made his family feel unwelcome in their own home. One by one, a dozen residents stood up and shared their stories of petty tyranny and abuse. It was a powerful, emotional tidal wave of shared grievance. Finally, Jessica took the floor. She didn't speak as a resident, but as a legal expert. She calmly and methodically laid out the financial case, presenting in large copies of the landscaping contract, the vote for the illegal stipend, and the budget discrepancies. She explained the legal concepts of fiduciary duty, fraud, and embezzlement in plain, simple terms that everyone could understand. She explained that the board's actions had exposed every single homeowner to massive legal and financial risk. When she was finished, the room was silent. There was nothing left to say. The vote was called. It wasn't even close. It was a landslide. Karen and Gerald were recalled by a vote of 284 to 3. The 3 no votes were from Karen, Gerald, and Karen's cousin, who also lived in the neighborhood. As the result was announced, a wave of applause and cheers swept through the room. Karen just sat there, her face a blank mask of shock. Her reign was over, but her problems were just beginning. The evidence we had compiled was handed over to the district attorney's office, which promptly launched a criminal investigation into fraud and embezzlement. Her pathetic little kingdom had not only been dismantled, it was now a crime scene. The fall of Karen was only the beginning of the community's restoration. Justice, we learned, is a two-part process. First, you remove the poison, then you heal the wound. With the old board gone, an interim board was elected at that same explosive meeting. It was composed of people who had been at the forefront of the fight. Jessica, the lawyer, the young father who'd been fined for the playset, a retired accountant, and, to his own surprise and the thunderous applause of his neighbors, George Peterson. Their first official act, passed by a unanimous vote just minutes after they were sworn in, was to formally rescind every fine levied by Karen's board over the past 2 years that was deemed punitive or discriminatory. My $1,500 penalty was wiped from the books, along with dozens of others. A public letter of apology was drafted and sent to every resident who had been targeted, with a special personal apology delivered to George. Their second act was to fire Evergreen Solutions, LLC, Karen's cousin's landscaping company, and to open a transparent bidding process for a new contractor. They also passed a new bylaw requiring any and all board compensation, stipends, or reimbursements to be approved by a majority vote of the entire Homeowners Association at the annual meeting, ensuring that kind of self-dealing could never happen again. The atmosphere in Oakmont Estates changed almost overnight. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and empowerment. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been avoiding eye contact now waved and smiled. The invisible walls Karen had built between us came crumbling down. A few weeks later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, A group of us gathered at George's house. We brought lumber, tools, and a new brass plaque. Together, we rebuilt the memorial bench for his wife, Martha, placing it right back amongst her prize-winning roses. George directed the work, a joyful, tearful smile on his face. When it was finished, he sat on it, patting the wood next to him as if she were sitting there. "She would have loved this," he said to all of us. "She would have loved all of you." That, for me, was the real victory. It wasn't about the fines or the Suburbans. It was about seeing the decency and kindness of a community, long suppressed by a petty tyrant, finally allowed to flourish. As for Karen, her downfall was as complete as it was deserved. The district attorney's investigation led to indictments for her and her cousin. Faced with overwhelming evidence, both pleaded guilty to lesser charges to avoid a trial. Karen was convicted of felony embezzlement. She had to pay back every cent of the illegal stipend and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and was legally barred from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity again. Her house went up for sale a month later. She and her husband moved away in the middle of the night, a final, pathetic retreat from the community she had tried and failed to dominate. My 2 black Suburbans remained parked in my driveway. They were no longer a source of contention. Instead, they became a sort of local landmark, a quiet symbol of the time a federal agent used his skills not to protect a president, but to liberate a neighborhood. The story became a sort of local legend, told at block parties and neighborhood gatherings. The final scene of this drama wasn't in a courtroom or at an HOA meeting. It was in my own backyard a few months later. We hosted a neighborhood-wide barbecue. The yard was filled with laughter, the smell of grilling food and the sound of children playing, including the kids who now had a brightly colored, fully approved playset. George was there, holding court and telling stories about Martha. Jessica was discussing lawn care with the Hispanic family. Sarah and I stood on our deck, looking out at the scene. This was the community we had been looking for. This was the sanctuary we had wanted. It hadn't been given to us. We had to fight for it. I learned a valuable lesson. The skills I had honed over a career in the Secret Service, threat assessment, strategic planning, intelligence gathering, and the calm application of overwhelming force at a decisive point, were just as effective against a domestic tyrant in a muumuu as they were against any other threat. Sometimes protecting your home requires the same resolve as protecting a nation, and the victory, when it comes, is just as sweet.